of the February Teen Dating Violence and Prevention webinar series. What we're doing today is we're going to go in depth a little bit more on what prevention actually is and how to do prevention. And that's something that, and I'll introduce myself here in a little bit, but that's something that I think is hard for people to break down. So we would love to help you break down what prevention looks like when it comes to violence. So I'll introduce myself and also my co-presenter here. And also show you my screen. So my name's Claudia Plesha, and I'm a project coordinator at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I primarily work with youth to prevent teen dating violence, but more importantly is to promote healthy relationships. And I'll also introduce you to my lovely colleague here, Kelly, and she'll tell you a little bit more about herself. And then I'll give you a quick outline of our presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hey, everyone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, perfect. Yay, thanks. We just had a quick, I shouldn't be pushing phone buttons.
To briefly recap, I am Kelly, and I am the VISTA leader supporting the AmeriCorps program with the network. And I moved here in September to Juneau, and I'm very happy to be talking about prevention programs with you today. And over to Claudia.
Okay, awesome. I'll try not to touch the phone ever again. So my name's Claudia Plesha, and one of the primary reasons why I do this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it is that in my studies at my school, when I went to college, and maybe even when I was growing up, I was always wondering why negative things were happening. And there was never quite a solution to it. We'd study the problem over and over, but nobody could really tell us what to do. And really, when we were doing work with communities, that's all communities want to do, is find a solution together. So So again, and I don't want to focus on the problem too much, but when we're looking at violence in Alaska, we see that rates are extremely high, and extremely high for women and extremely high for Alaska Native women. We see that half, if not more, of all Alaska women have experienced domestic violence or sexual assault in their lifetime. And we know that anybody can be a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault, and while there are some patterns, the high numbers of violence really prompt us to find a solution to this. In addition, when it comes to this being a public health issue, this is also not something that, this is not the way that it's been defined in the past. So, however, women that experience domestic violence and sexual assault have severe health impacts. It impacts them individually, it impacts the family, and it impacts us as a community, because we then need to have provide services for the victims and also for their families. So, hi Olga, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us from home. So we have all of these services that we need to provide to victims, and also accountability, right? So perpetration. There's also the cost of criminalizing and holding folks accountable. And so there's some severe health impacts But if we could prevent violence before it happens, if we could prevent it before it occurs, we can prevent other things from happening. And I won't go too much more into this, but we know that when we prevent teen dating violence, we're actually preventing multiple things from happening. And also, we are also preventing more serious violence from happening. As youth age out, as they become adults, violence becomes more fatal and it becomes more serious. And so if we can prevent it before those adolescents develop their dating habits, then we actually can prevent lots of different problems in the long run. Additionally, we know that there's also some correlation between being a victim of teen dating violence and engaging in high-risk behaviors. So if we can prevent somebody from being a victim of teen dating violence, we can also prevent those high-risk behaviors. So I know they're right there on your screen, but thinking about this, what are some things that a victim of teen dating violence might do to cope that might count as a risky behavior? And you can chat, you can put it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. So what are some things that somebody who's a victim of teen dating violence might engage in? What are some things that they might do to cope with being a victim? So drinking, substance abuse, So when we experience violence, oh, go ahead.
Oh, missing school.
Missing school, So earlier in the last slide, we saw that for adult women, that might be missing work. But for our students, for our youth, it's missing school, which has academic impact. Missing school is not, you can't just miss school anytime that you want to, even if you're able to make up the content in some way. It's not quite the same, right, as having good attendance, so there's all of these things that could actually add up over time. You could be using drinking or substances to cope as well. So I'll actually zoom into here. But we also see that sexual behavior might be impacted if you're a victim of teen dating violence. And what are some things what would it look like for risky sexual behavior for a victim? What would that maybe look like? This is a little harder to think about. So sending the wrong message, then getting taken advantage of. So maybe not being clear with your boundaries, and then somebody being able to push those boundaries because you're not strong enough in being able to communicate those to them. And so then you either get taken advantage of or you don't get what you want from that interaction. So seeking attention in the wrong way with risky sexual behavior. So maybe drawing out attention to the problem, but maybe not having the support system to actually do it in a proper way. So then you're acting out in all these other areas. And some of the examples that we had is that we see that if you're using substances to cope, and if there's violence in your life, you may not be able to say what your boundaries are. And so you might end up having sex at an earlier age. You might be using substances. Your perpetrator might actually be using substances to numb you. In addition, you may not have control over when you get to use a condom. So we have all of these things that go along with teen dating violence. We see sexual behavior that's riskier. We see alcohol and drug abuse. And so if we are able to prevent teen dating violence, we can prevent a whole lot of other issues for individuals, and then also, like we talked about earlier, for communities. So are there any questions so far? Because we're just going to get to the good part, which is the solution, right? Like, what do we do about this? We have such high numbers in our state. What do we do about it? And I believe prevention is part of that. So are there questions, though, so far? Okay, so no questions. So what is prevention? How do we prevent violence that hasn't even occurred yet? Well, that's what we're here to break down with you. So primary prevention, there's 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. There's, and the definitions are up there. But primary prevention really deals with promoting positive, healthy things before violence ever happens. Secondary prevention deals with early intervention. So intervening when some of those unhealthy behaviors start to occur in a relationship maybe, or maybe before even somebody's dating, they have some unhealthy expectations of what their partner would do or be for them. So intervening early, that's what secondary prevention would look like. And tertiary prevention also looks at how we respond when violence does happen and holding the perpetrators accountable for that violence. And so there's an image of a rope there on the right-hand side of your screen. And the reason why we have that there is because really prevention and our efforts to stop violence is the strongest when we have all 3 levels of prevention. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need response and accountability. We wouldn't need tertiary prevention, right? But violence is still happening at alarming rates. And so we need to have a response to that, and we need to hold people accountable. However, if we can put most of our resources in primary and secondary prevention, less and less money should be going to responding to actual violence, and less money should be going to criminalizing or holding people accountable when they perpetrate violence. So ideally, we want to work to do primary prevention while also partnering with other folks that are able to do intervening and then also hold people accountable. Ooh. So let me go back here. Okay. So I often use this story when I talk about prevention. It's kind of a public health parable, if you have. But going upriver, and the idea that prevention is going upriver. So what does that mean? So imagine that you're a fisherman, and that can't be that hard for any of us here in Alaska. But imagine that you're out fishing, right? And you know you're super excited. It's a beautiful day. We love to take advantage of good days here. And you're just about to get your line out on the water, but you see that there's a child struggling, floating by, just barely hanging on. And so you jump in there and you pull that person to shore. You know, you get them all okay, make sure that they're good, and you send them on their way. So right when you're about to get your line back out there again, there's another couple people. So you help them, you intervene, and you stop that from happening. And then you try to go back out to fishing one more time to just have it happen again. But you make a decision this time. You're going to help these people, but you're going to go up the river and figure out exactly what's going on. Because it is not good enough to just pull people out of the river, to pull people out of violence. Trauma and mental health issues and some of these other things could have already happened in a very real way. And so walking upriver, going upriver and figuring out exactly what happened, and you know, there may be an explanation. So you go upriver and you notice that there's a bridge that's broken. So people continue to cross it. People continue to walk across it, and they fall in. And so not only can you stop people, maybe put up a sign that says, do not cross this bridge, or you can work with the people that are around to fix the bridge so that the issue doesn't continue to happen. And you can have a good day of fishing, right? So this is what prevention is doing, and that's why sometimes when we think about prevention, we think about it as going upriver, finding out where the root of that problem is and addressing it in a direct way. So primary prevention, which you heard a little bit about, but its main focus is to prevent first-time perpetration and victimization. Nobody falling into the river. And how do we do that? Is we have found that there are certain things that can protect someone from being a victim or a perpetrator, and there's certain things that can minimize, that can protect someone, and then there's also some things that can put someone at risk. And so we work to promote those things that are positive and to minimize the things that are negative. And we'll break down some more as to how to do that, right? Because me telling you that doesn't quite help you enough. So we'll go through that. But prevention is also evidence-based and culture-based. So it uses what works in Alaska and in communities, and it also has an evaluation component so that we can tell what the impact has been for those programs. So Kelly here is going to tell us a little bit more about risk and protective factors and what they are.
Hi guys. So we know that on an individual level, there are personal and biological characteristics that can contribute to an individual's susceptibility in becoming a perpetrator or victim of violence. So what we're looking at here are risk factors that are variables that make a person more likely to become a victim or perpetrator of domestic violence. Here we have age. So we know that a young age can actually make individuals more vulnerable. Gender. As we've talked about before, women are generally, and young girls, are a specific target population that are specifically vulnerable to this violence. And we also see that males tend to be the perpetrators. Education level, that can also be a risk factor. Those that are at a lower education level are generally more vulnerable. Economic factors such as unemployment or living in poverty. Mental health, and this could also be, we've talked a little bit about social connectedness, but perhaps having a negative outlook or different personality disorders. When we talk about social health, we're talking about connectedness. This can be within a family unit or with your general community and with your culture. And also prior exposure to violence. We see specifically with children, once they've been exposed to violence, that can have a direct impact on their susceptibility to becoming a victim of violence in the future. When we talk about protective factors, and this is really what we try to maximize in our programming, we see that a high self-esteem can help protect against violence. We also see that a sense of identity can create a protective factor. We try to do this a lot of in our programming with connecting to one's history and one's ancestry and your culture. Stability can also be a protective factor within the family, and connection to others, connection to your family, connection to different resources, and a knowledge of what those resources are. So all of these examples exist on an individual level, but they also exist on separate levels, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with the social ecological model. For example, we can imagine that with the individual, all of these factors are present, but then in the community, how does this really look like? One of the ways we try to do this is by changing community norms around violence. Connection to others as an individual is positive, but how do we create a norm in our community that is expected, that violence is going to be held accountable? And this exists on an even higher level when we change laws and policies that will impact violence in our community.
Mm-hmm. So your violence prevention work can look very different depending on the kinds of activities that you think are important. And Kelly mentioned the social ecological model, and what I'll do is I'll actually pull it up for you. And the reason why we use this model is because we don't create our beliefs in a vacuum. We don't come up with our beliefs, we don't come up with our behaviors all by ourselves. There's some individual level power that we get to decide what we want for ourselves. However, a lot of what we believe, a lot of what we want, even what we desire in our lives, and what we consider normal is not coming from the individual, but really from the relationships and the community that that individual is nestled in addition to the society that those communities are part of. So when we're looking at how to change norms, we're looking across all of these different levels, right? And we're also looking at all of these activities that could impact those levels. And so your prevention work, depending on the skills that you have, depending on the resources that you have, depending on the need in your community that you have, could look like any of these activities here. So we're looking at strengthening individual knowledge and skills, so helping kids develop healthy relationship skills, helping kids develop their self-esteem individually, so how they feel about themselves, how they feel about problem solving, giving them communication skills. Also educating the community and educating providers. So bringing that community education to the forefront, helping communities understand what a healthy relationship might look like and how to promote that, and then also educating providers who oftentimes are the front line to healthcare services. So if we can help educate them in healthy relationships or what an unhealthy relationship might look like, we could help impact that. And then there's also some works around connecting to one another, looking at organizations and changing practices that can impact violence levels. So an example of that within schools could be, you know, what happens when a couple is in trouble for fighting? How is that addressed? Does anybody do anything more than just giving them the attention? Is anybody going to talk to them about their relationship? And so putting in place a practice within the school to address what to do when that happens. And some of our communities are also doing policy and legislative work. So to impact how legislatures and how policymakers spend money and how they also criminalize perpetrators and help victims. So your prevention could look like any of these activities because ultimately we're trying to impact that last box there. And so we like models as public health people, but if we are trying to impact that end result there, which is romantic relationship quality, how scientific and boring, like they just took the romance all out of there. But if we are trying to impact that piece, it is not enough to impact just the two partners that are there, their perceptions, their attitudes, and their behaviors, but it's important to impact the peer context, the school, and the community context in which that person is finding themselves in. So now it probably sounds like to you that you need to have 6 different programs, and they all need to address all of these different things, but Kelly is actually going to talk about a program here in a second that is one program that actually addresses multiple levels of prevention of the ecological model. And so she's going to talk a little bit about how it's possible to do that with just one program, with maybe limited resources, and with just one group of folks. So Kelly?
Thanks, Claudia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Girls on the Run, and you can see a picture of those girls right under this social ecological model. So Girls on the Run is a program that engages young girls through interactive lessons and running games, really to try to develop self-respect and healthy relationships and a lifestyle. So when we think about the social ecological model, we see that on the individual level, these girls are impacted because they're learning about respect, they're learning about their bodies, they're learning about their own identity and their self-esteem, and that really strengthens them and gives them a lot of those protective factors that we talked about earlier. But there's also the influencer level, and this exists when we think about the teachers that are impacted, because a lot of times this program is integrated as an after-school activity. So the teachers are exposed to this curriculum. The coaches that are often recruited from the community, or often are teachers themselves, are also learning about this curriculum and then acting it out in their own lives. And so this also reinforces their own healthy relationships and their own self-esteem. We also see that there's a parent component. So this curriculum is brought home to the family and kind of talked about, discussed there. We also see that this one program, not only the individual, not only this influencer level, but the community-wide. At the end of the season, there is a 5K that sort of celebrates what the girls have learned and what they've accomplished. And often volunteers that come are from the community. This is a big event that is often a fundraiser, and a lot of community members come and learn about what this programming is, are exposed to what we're talking about here, and that changes a lot of the norms about how do we talk about young girls and talk about their identity. And that kind of has impacts on the society level as this changes norms. Girls on the Run is an international program. It's here in Alaska, but it's also throughout many different states, and so that helps us build coalitions that span those states. So this is one program that exists comprehensively throughout these separate levels of the social ecological model.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, we've kind of talked at you for a little bit of time. And one more. Okay. So I guess, you know, one thing that we use in the past is this exercise. That's kind of funny, but it works to show that really to change how we're looking at violence in our communities, we do have to address it at multiple levels. And again, thank you, Kelly, for sharing that piece of information on Girls on the Run. It doesn't have to be multiple programs that do this, but why do we do multiple programs? Or why do we try to impact all of those levels? And I think I've showed you that model as well. But another way to think about it is, if you take a look at that picture, it looks like all of those breakfast items are just having a fun old party. However, it looks like milk, all buffed up with protein, is kicking out hot dog. So you're thinking, what the heck? Okay, but so this is kind of an exercise to get us to think about a norm in our society that we just kind of take for granted. So how many of you, and please type it in the chat box, and some of you I'm sure have heard this, but how many of you eat hot dogs for breakfast? So yes, no, maybe, you can just type it in. No, thank you. Not even really good hot dogs? All right. No, okay. Nope, okay. So none of us eat hot dogs for breakfast. Why not? Right? I mean, we eat sausage for breakfast. Hot dog is a type of sausage. But that's because that's not what our norm is in our society and in our communities. So if I were to wake up a month from now, 2 months from now, let's say I go into a coma. Wow, this is getting deep. Let's say, what would it take for us to reframe this meal as a breakfast meal? What would it take for us to accept, all of us, to wake up tomorrow and say, absolutely, I will take a hot dog for breakfast? So what exactly would it take for us to do that? What are some ideas? What do you think we would do if our team was in charge of making hot dogs for breakfast? Commercials. So we don't see a whole lot of commercials for hot dogs that mention that, hey, you could have this for breakfast too. Education. So we could have a whole institute that could get together and do presentations on the high nutritious value of hot dogs and why a high nutritious hot dog for breakfast is more than the logical thing to do. Okay, what else would we do? Right. So if we were to make this and take this to sort of a societal, national, community level, there's some things that we would have to do. So we would have to create some commercials. Maybe we would have superstars or musicians or athletes talk about how a hot dog really helps them in competition or before their concert or whatever. We could actually serve them in schools so that a whole generation of kids could start off their morning with a hot dog and they wouldn't find it so strange. We could also work right. So Olga, who is out in St. Paul, worked with us to do a commercial, and they did a great job. By the end of us filming those spots, they were actually just running the whole thing. Producer, doing the sound, checking the what things looked like. So we could get some youth to do a campaign to talk about how cool it is to eat a hot dog for breakfast. So I guess the point is, and it's a little bit silly, right? The point is that we would have to reach across all these levels, and we would have to reframe this new norm for our communities for it to really take. We couldn't just do one thing. We couldn't just do a one-time thing. And we would have to reach across multiple audiences for it to really take, if our goal really was to have hot dogs be a breakfast food. So that's sort of what we're talking about with you. There's lots of training and planning to do for prevention, but it's going to include your whole community, and it might include more than just you. It might include more than just the folks that maybe you already work with, but it really will include a whole community working together to end violence. And so I want to open it up to some questions at this point. We're going to talk about our programming as well and what we do very briefly, but I just wanted to open it up to some questions for folks. Okay. Well, thank you. You all are being very patient with all of our talking here. But our organization really is trying to work across these levels to decrease violence statewide. So the things that we are focused on, and again, I won't go too deeply into this because the programs actually speak a little bit more. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a statewide infrastructure that looks at all the prevention efforts around the state and coordinates them to some degree. We're also working with youth and schools as leaders in prevention. And so we have programming for schools and we also have programming for youth. Additionally, we're also working with communities. So having communities really guide the conversation for where they want prevention to go in their communities. We also have some media components that really help shift those norms statewide. So Olga, I'll talk a little bit more about the fourth R, but there is curriculum for the schools and for teachers, and they can receive some training from for that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. That's actually our next slide. And then statewide, we're also trying to go up the river. Right, so that's like that's our last thing. Alongside the media pieces, we're also trying to provide ways to go up the river and find what the causes of violence are. So what really is happening? Why is it happening? We're trying to find what that is. And for our state, part of the answer is the historical trauma that took place for the people here. And some of those historical roots are playing a big role, and so addressing them is important to addressing that violence. So, Olga, you had a question about school. So the fourth R, and the fourth R stands for relationships. So it's reading, writing, arithmetic, right, and relationships, is a school-based curriculum for grades 7 through 9. And it includes lessons not just on healthy relationships and dating violence, but then also on substance abuse and healthy sexuality, which are all of those three things that we kind of talked about earlier, right? So how can you have a healthy relationship if you are not communicating with your partner what your sexual needs are, or if you're abusing substances to cope and things like that. So it includes lessons for teens that are beyond healthy relationships. And it also changes the school context as well, because we have this training that's offered to teachers so that they themselves can be more comfortable in addressing these topics and talking with their students. So Olga, I can try and get you some information on when maybe the next 4SAR training might be for teachers. And the other thing is, and we'll talk about evaluation for prevention, but one piece of each program that we do is the evaluation piece. So we know that the 4SAR is working because we're measuring that, and students report that they've learned more about healthy relationships and about the importance of family, but then also how to negotiate with their partner. They've also learned about substance abuse prevention, suicide prevention, and pregnancy prevention. So again, we're looking at preventing multiple things, which if you're trying to think of a way to really get prevention happening in your community, you can link to all of these other issues and to the work happening around these other issues, right? Because we're not just preventing one bad thing happening to one person, but we're actually increasing our whole entire community's wellness, and then also preventing substance abuse in some way, suicide, and also pregnancy. Awesome, Olga. So I'll get you that information. We also partner with youth. And so we have programs that help shift norms around violence. And so we have the media campaigns. We also have funds to support mini grants so that communities have access to funding when they do this work. And then we also have projects that are more culturally based in working with rural communities, such as the When I'm an Elder project, which actually Olga was part of, and it was extremely beneficial to work with Olga and with the community there to create these messages of nonviolence, to make them more real to students. So those are the programs that we use. But more importantly, we also know that they work. We also know that youth, when they go back from being part of these projects, so Lead On is one of those projects, we see that their youth leadership skills have increased, but then they've also been able to build a community project and bring it back with them. And about 85% of those youth were able to complete those community projects. So we know that these work. We know that there's interaction. And if you can see there in that picture, Disney, you might recognize some people there. You see that we're not just engaging teens when we do some of this programming, but we're working with elders as well. We're working with an entire population so that the entire community can support the youth going back and doing projects. Any questions so far? Olga, is there anything you'd like to say about the When I'm an Elder project that we worked on together? Okay. If there is anything you'd like to add, please make sure to put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, Olga. Oh, you were typing, sorry. But yeah, it really was an opportunity for all of us to get the youth to think about their role in the future of their community. And I think it helps the adults. It gave the adults something to think about. And I additionally also learned from that process. And so we're continually working with youth and learning from youth so that when we're trying to prevent teen dating violence, we're speaking their language. So thank you, Olga. Thank you so much for sharing that. Another piece of our work is partnering with young men and boys. For the longest time, this was really framed as a women's issue, and really it's more of a family issue. One of the risk factors, Kelly, was
lack of connectedness.
Lack of connectedness. So if young men and boys are not connecting to positive role models, but then also viewing violence, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't have, if you're a teen, if you're a young boy and you're seeing violence, the entire family sees that. And so the impact of violence isn't just limited to young women or to mothers or moms, but it's actually impacting the entire family. So working with men and boys to reframe that is extremely important. And we've seen that men want to be part of this movement. We have some media campaigns, kind of like the Stand Up, Speak Up media campaigns that are out there. And we also work with young men and boys to film those. And then we also have some resources that actually reach young men where they're at. So Compass is a tool that can be used with some training for mentoring young boys. And so training mentors to have positive conversations and using this guide for that. Coaching Boys into Men is also a program offered through athletic departments throughout the state. And what it does is really helps leverage that role that coaches play in youth lives so that they actually are having meaningful conversations. I mean, we could all be talking about sports, or we could all be talking about some of these other things that are pretty important in our lives, but young men also need to know how to interact with young women or with somebody that they're interested in or partner. And they also need to think about who they want to be as men. And so we also do evaluation work through surveys, and we'll talk just a little bit more about that. But we do some evaluation work for this as well, just so that we know that we're reaching the right audience, that we're impacting the men that we're working with, and that we can also continue to improve our programming, because we'd love to have a perfect program, but everything is a work in progress. So Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about resources for building your capacity for prevention, and I know a lot of you are actually going to be very interested in this, because a 1-hour webinar, and we're getting close to the end of our hour here. We still have time, we're okay, but 1-hour webinar really isn't going to get you 100% to where you need to be as far as being prepared. So Kelly's going to talk about some next steps that you can take to help increase your capacity for doing prevention, but then also maybe increasing the capacity of your community too.
Hello everyone. So I think one of the best resources to get in touch with if you are interested in this work are the training modules. And how you will find these, they're all on YouTube. You can Google ANDVSA training modules. It's one of the first things that will come up, and if you click on that, it might actually take you to our website that has a link in there with these modules, but they can also all be found online. This is a great training series because it kind of takes you through a natural progression of where you would start if you want to integrate prevention programming into your organization or as an individual who is just interested in this work. Mm-hmm. So Module 1 kind of takes an introduction to DVSA, domestic violence and sexual assault, which is kind of what we're going through today, Prevention 101. If you are interested in this, one of the great things about these modules is you can go at your own speed. You can watch again and again until you feel like you have a really strong foundation of what is happening in our state and what these definitions really mean. Module 3 is primary prevention, the social ecological model we've talked about, and a little bit more in depth about the risk and protective factors, as well as where they exist on the social ecological model. Module 4 is very interesting, kind of going into community mobilization and coalition building, which is so important in this work. If you see any of these programming, you realize almost immediately there's no way that you can do this on your own. And that kind of takes us into the next module, which is primary prevention planning. You really need a plan when you're doing this, and it can be difficult to kind of take all the different elements into a different program and kind of mesh them all together. And so this is kind of a great way to get your thinking on that. And then putting your plans into action in that next module. And the last one, which is always very important, is evaluation. Evaluation is not only important so that we know what our impact is, but it's also great because it can help us refine what sort of program we want to do in the future. So I would just encourage all of you, if you are interested in learning more, to check out those modules, which can be found on YouTube.
So the community mobilization part really is really important, and as you can see in this lineup here, we've barely made it through to risk and protective factors, and that's not and that was kind of in a quick way as well. So there's lots more to know, and additionally, not just for yourself, but maybe other people can be brought in. Oh yes, so what I will do is I will actually put it into the chat box. Okay, it's right here. Perfect.
There we go.
So what I'll do is I'll put this training into the chat box because that really is very important to okay, so that really is important to what your next steps are going to be, right? It's not something that can happen overnight. It's not something that you can just make happen. However, the way that's pretty freeing, because it means that it's not all on you, right? It means that you can involve other people in the community, and that there's some real tools for making that happen. So I encourage all of you to go and take a look at these prevention modules, and if you think that there's a partner that needs this training, make sure that they get it also, so that you all as a partnership or as a collaboration can speak the same language. And so I think it's important for anybody that's about to start this work, but then also for anybody else that you kind of bring into it as well. So Kelly, do you want to also talk a little bit about?
Sure. This is another web series called Addressing Barriers to Health and Safety. There are several different webinars on this, and this kind of gets into discussing various aspects of the work, including root causes of violence. We also talk about resiliency and the ways that communities and individuals can adapt when facing adversity. So in addition to that, we talk about deconstructing gender norms and norms around violence. So this is a very interesting and sort of comprehensive look at different barriers to health and safety and how to find this, and we might be able to find a way to link that in the chat box. But you can find all of this on YouTube by searching Addressing Barriers to Health and Safety, and it's an entire web series on that.
So, and the reason why we're talking about these kind of next to each other is because really that additional training for you and your partner is going to be critical. And as you all get really familiar with what prevention is, you're going to want to explore and go upriver. And what this series does is really help break down some of the reasons why, the root causes of violence, right? So that we can continue to train and have this conversation in our communities and address the causes for it, right? Without us having to create the training ourselves or to bring somebody into our community, which can be very expensive. So really it's about continuing that education for ourselves and our partners so that we can create the biggest impact that we possibly can. And so that's the other thing that we're doing, is we are partnering with role models. So when we're thinking about, here we are, we're impacting the schools, we're impacting, you know, young people where they're at, maybe in their relationships, and sort of through the media, we try to find them online. But they spend most of their time with their parents and with other adults. So if those adults are not reinforcing the same messages, if those adults aren't having conversations, even if they're positive adults, then we're missing out kind of a big segment of that population and of sort of that sphere of influence. And so we did some work with parents to find out really what they needed, and with other role models to find out really what they needed to have these conversations. And it turns out that there's some resources that can help break that down, so that we can get parents on board as well. So we don't just have professionals, we don't just have teachers, we don't just have people whose job at some point ends, but we have parents as well that are on board, and also mentors that maybe don't fit into any of these other professional categories normally. So for the Talk Now, Talk Often, there's actually conversation cards, which you can get at tntoak.org. And they're a great resource for starting the conversation in your community in a positive way. So it's about creating those connections, and it's about doing it in a way that empowers the whole community. And so those norms around, hey, do I talk to my kid about relationships? Of course I do. Yes, I do. Everyone does. That's the kind of shift that we can expect if we are also working with this population as well. So our prevention work, and I wanted to share with you this map. So what we do is we kind of take all of these different approaches to try to impact across those different levels. And so you don't need to do anything like this. This is our approach, but what I'm saying is that different communities are using different resources depending on what works for them. And so we see some communities where Lead On, our Youth Leadership Conference, really is a powerful way of getting youth to talk about issues in their communities. Then we see that sometimes in bigger communities like Anchorage or Fairbanks, something like Green Dot works much better, because it's about large populations, it's about helping people intervene if they see something. And then we also see that some communities are, really interested in engaging parents and sort of using that avenue. And so take what you need and adapt it, and find out what works in your community. So this is what I wanted to get to, and I'm sorry it took so long. But I think that there are some next steps to getting started. And this one webinar, this one training, as much information as we could fit into 1 hour, it's still not enough to necessarily get you started. So how do you get started? How do you start doing prevention work in your community? So here's some first steps, and maybe there's some others I haven't thought of, but here's some things that we have found help. So assess your community. Who is doing what work? What is going on in our community? Are people aware of the problem even? Do I need to start with an awareness campaign? Or do I need to get my community ready to do prevention work before I do prevention work? Do I need to start an awareness campaign? And so that's the kind of information that you can find out if you assess your community. If you just start out doing some kind of a program without seeing if your community really needs that or not, the impact is limited, and the outcome is also in question, right? Additionally, who else is doing work in your community? Who else is doing prevention in your community? So there may be some folks that are doing bullying prevention. There may be some folks doing suicide prevention. There may be some folks that are maybe doing substance abuse prevention. So who else is doing prevention in your community? And remember how all of these things are linked. So if you can find out who else is interested in being part of it, who else is already part of it in some way, and also what groups should be at the table if all of those levels are going to be impacted. So assess your community, figuring out where it is at and what those groups are and what they're doing. And then also think about youth. So what are youth in your community up to? Are they interested in being part of this? and what is the vehicle for youth leadership in your community. And that can be a good way of starting the conversation. And then also finding out, again, it could be part of your assessment, finding out where your community is at. Are they ready to do this work, or do I need to prepare them to do this work? Two pieces that we mentioned earlier, but make sure you plan for prevention and train for prevention. So give yourself the training that you need, give your partners the training that you need, and sit down and do the planning before you jump into programming. This will make it so that the right people are at the table, the right program is at the table, and that really you are not the only one doing it, which in the long run can be pretty hard for one person to put all of this on. Also, think about getting some training and doing some planning for evaluation, which is not something that we were able to touch on very much during this call. But as you could see, all of our programming has some evaluation components. And evaluation programming is much stronger when we're applying for funding, when we're making the case to our communities, and then also when we're improving the programming. So to say we are continuing to address some things in our program, which is part of its strength. So really thinking about evaluation as a very necessary component of prevention. And I think I've mentioned this before, but really use and adapt existing resources. There's lots of programs in our state that you have access to for free. There's lots of trainings like this one. And then there's also, you know, your own knowledge from your community. There's also the resources in your community that you can use to help adapt what you find statewide. So make sure to use all of your resources, including yourself, and to adapt them to what your community need is. And I always kind of end on this quote, but it is something that a youth that we worked with said. And I believe that this is our ultimate goal for all of us doing this work in Alaska, whether we're able to dedicate, you know, our entire work lives to it, whether it's just a piece of it, whether volunteers. But really, I think all of our goals is to really end violence in Alaska. And a youth said it really well. She said, when I'm an elder, I want to know the cycle of salmon, not the cycle of violence. So that's really what we're striving for, and I encourage you to use the tools that you have and to reach out to all of us to get this work started in your community. And it's very doable, it's very possible, and we've seen great results. Connect with us, and we'd love to tell you more. So looks like I'm a little bit over on time. I do want to say thank you. If there are some questions and you want to stay a little bit later, maybe just a few minutes after, go ahead and type them out. If you have to go somewhere and rush off, don't worry about it. Go off and go. But I just wanted to say thank you for being here, for being part of this work. It is really important to have all of you and to have all communities from across the state really be part of this movement. So I want to say thank you. Please promote additional trainings and sort of this work to anybody else that you think might be interested. Thank you everyone. All right, thank you so much.